put a writing up that Neil Welsh, he was the head of the FBI in Philadelphia, he closed the file in 1976, which was 5 years after. Now, there are ways around statutes of limitations, and so particularly if you've left the state, and it's been 40 years, most of them have left the state at some time or other, and an argument could be made that you were fleeing to avoid prosecution. If they can establish that, it's what's called tolling of the statute, and basically the statute doesn't have any effect. So I didn't think there was any good faith basis to prosecute them. It's been 40 years. But you don't know what they'll do, right? They may investigate, they may call a grand jury and investigate. In the Camden 28 case, the defendants were all acquitted, but people who refused to testify against them in a grand jury spent over a year in jail. So you just don't know. There could have been various forms of harassment. So I did a memo for them. They wanted to know, of course, what their risks were, but on the whole, they decided to risk it. And the FBI's reaction really surprised us all, including me. I thought they were going to say, well, we have to look into this. We had alerted the New York Times and we set a date. It was the story was embargoed, January 7th, 2014. We were holding a news conference. They were going to reveal themselves in person. And it was an international news conference with calls coming in from all over. And in advance of that, the Times reporter and the other reporters who were alerted had to ask the FBI, what's your comment, right? They couldn't print their story without a comment from the other side. So the FBI had a prepared comment, and it's rather amazing. They kind of took credit for the action. They said there were problems in the FBI. A lot of different things led to changes. That's a vague reference to people breaking into their office, you know. And the changes were good. They praised the changes, and we've stuck by the changes. Now, some people would question that. But they basically said it's all over. They're not even considering prosecution. So that was a little sigh of relief, you know, on our side. Particularly mine, I'd have a lot of work to do. This was an easy win this way.
So how many of the folks are still living in the Philadelphia area?
3. And not all 8 of them went public. There's 2 who decided not to. And that was honored by everybody. There's a terrific book, if you're interested in this, called The Burglary, The Discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's Secret FBI. It's really terrific. It's out in paperback already.
Was the 9th person revealed?
No,
So they're respecting the 9th person's confidentiality, even in the face of his
it's not
threat
in the
to
book,
possibly.
It's not in the movie, any of those 3, or in any of the discussions that any of us have. We've respected that.
Any other questions, anyone? Other questions? No?
So go ahead.
I'm not clear. You're the attorney who gave them some advice. When did you first hear about their involvement? And was there any jeopardy on your part? I don't know whether attorneys are in jeopardy when somebody admits to a crime, but I'm curious about your.
Usually not, but you never know in something like this, particularly back then, right? So I guess there was some jeopardy, but that wasn't a very serious one.
But the statute of limitations had not run by the time.
Absolutely. Well, what had happened? Here's Keith Forsyth.
I'm late, I'm sorry. I got my times mixed up.
If he'd have taken this long to get that door open, right?
I think I took a lot longer to get that door open,
They'd have never
actually.
gotten the action done. But your question was what?
I was interested in your own jeopardy.
Oh, well, what happened was Keith called me and said, we're about to do something. If we get caught, it sounded like it was heavy, but they didn't tell me what it is, and I wouldn't want him to tell me what it is. I wouldn't want to know the details. And he said, can we call you if we get busted? And I said, sure, but I didn't even know when it happened that it was what he had called me about, because there were so many demonstrations there, and that was a lot of my work. So I didn't know until later, he and one of the others came in and said, you know, will you represent us if we get caught? Which I said, sure, and I've never had to do much of anything.
Now,
Yeah,
Luckily,
luckily.
now, to your knowledge, with the passage of the Patriot Act, they talk about how some of these changes have been rolled back.
Yes.
And is there like, have you done any comparison of like, what did the Church Commission, like point by point, what did they do, and how does that relate to things in the Patriot Act?
The Patriot Act just wipes away pretty much all of it. I mean, what we saw here, and what you saw at the Church Committee hearing, was activities by the FBI as a political force to try to neutralize political groups and individuals they opposed on the left. It was pretty much limited to that. And what the Church Committee and the reforms that came out of that was, look, you're supposed to enforce laws. So if somebody hasn't broken a law and just has demonstrated and using their First Amendment rights, there shouldn't be a file on them, there shouldn't be an investigation. That should be it. But we're back. It's hard to say because we don't exactly know how far back, but I think it's pretty far.
the Church Committee, by the way, just to comment about that,
We have to swap.
okay, the fellow who was the chief counsel that you saw there in the film in his younger years, he's still kicking, but he doesn't look like that anymore.
No.
None of us do. He and a group of other prominent attorneys and jurists just put out a report very recently, within the past, I'd say, month or so, right? Something like that, talking about the Church Committee's original work and their view of the Patriot Act and how it altered that work over, with the perspective of time. And I haven't read the whole thing yet, but the part I read is pretty interesting, and it's very well written and very thoughtful.
Yeah. One example, they've changed the law of espionage to include things apparently that you wouldn't usually think of as espionage, much more innocuous than that.
It would be nice if they included things like the Logan Act on these people writing letters, right?
Maybe.
What about the statute?
Oh, sorry, he had the mic, yeah.
So could you just say something about, one thing is it's the issue of the Patriot Act, one thing it does is the role of the CIA and the NSA gets changed. And so there's supposed to be some division between them and the FBI, and historically there are certain tensions. Can you say anything about how the Patriot Act has led to sort of this blurring of all the old divisions and this, so in a certain sense, given the technology, the improved technology that can be used, and this blurring, that it really, do we even really know what's going on at this point? Is it so fuzzy and so, nobody's done the equivalent of breaking into the new Department of Homeland
And
Security.
we don't advise that.
And I know you would never advise
Keith did
that.
not
But
encourage
you
that.
could be called if someone was doing something.
Yeah. I think the blurring is significant, but there was blurring even before. It turned out back in the 70s, in the anti-war Vietnam War period, the Army was doing domestic intelligence work and had huge files
On American citizens.
on American citizens, even though their charter, specifically in the law, said that they have no domestic kind of role like that. It also was in the charter of the CIA. But they're all now perhaps more blended. I think you're right, and it's a bit more secret. And of course, Snowden revealed some of it.
What about statute of limitations now if a similar action took place?
What would the statute be?
Yeah.
The statute for espionage, if you're within that, where they claim you are, is 10 years, just twice. Federal statutes of limitations aren't traditionally that long. State ones are usually quite a bit longer.
But if you flee to avoid prosecution, then the statute doesn't start to run. So, I'm afraid Ed is out of luck unless we find another way to get him back.
Yeah.
Since you've come public, what has been the reaction you've perceived from people? I think you're a hero. But I don't know if everyone else does. And what's your reaction to Ed Snowden and sort of the reaction of America to Ed Snowden in terms of he's not been uniformly viewed as a hero. He's been vilified.
Right. Well, he's not old and harmless like me. So, yeah, I think those two questions are related. There's a kind of an interesting story about the first part of the question. So in December, shortly before the book and the movie were going to be revealed publicly for the first time, I was driving my father back to the community where he lives now, and he just recently moved from Ohio to be near us. And to put it mildly, my dad and I haven't agreed on politics since approximately 1965. So I said, so Dad, got something I need to talk to you about. Do you remember the church committee in the 70s when they investigated the CIA and the FBI and found out about all the nefarious things they were doing? He said, no, I remember Frank Church, but I don't remember that committee. And I said, so do you remember those people that broke into an FBI office and stole their documents and sent them to the press that was, revealed some of the dirty tricks the FBI was doing? He goes, no, I don't remember that either. But those people should get a medal. And I just about ran off the road. Luckily, no one was harmed, but it was close. And so I was shocked for a second, and I go, well, I'm glad you feel that way, Dad, because I was one of those people. And so, interestingly enough, my father is...
Was he surprised?
Yes, he was surprised, but he wasn't 100% surprised. I mean, it was not my first rodeo, shall we say. So he's kind of I guess if I had to summarize him, he's kind of a libertarian Republican, so he's like super conservative on a lot of things, but he's also not into big government, and I'll give him credit, he's consistent on that. Most people who say they're against big government are only against it if it's going to benefit poor people. But he's against it across the board, so I give him that. So anyway, that was an interesting conversation. So for the most part, the reaction has been very favorable, at least in public. I know there's plenty of people who don't agree with what we did. And I kind of wish more of them would come to these shows. We finally got one. We got one last time, and it made my day. I had somebody to argue with, because I think that's, part of what this is all about is the conversation. And let's get it out in the open and deal
Right
with
here at the Bryn Mawr Film Institute.
Right here at the Bryn Mawr Film Institute.
He accused you of being like people who kill their political opponents.
Right, exactly, yeah. It was basically, in his view, what I did was the same as what Sirhan did.
Yeah, to Bobby Kennedy.
That was the example he used. So anyway, it's an odd view of civil disobedience. But anyway, so that's... Oh, and in terms of Ed Snowden, yeah, I think it is easier to be in favor of me. What I did was 40 years ago, and it's just like the way people talk about Martin Luther King today. Everybody likes Martin Luther King today. A lot of those people did not like Martin Luther King in 1968. I remember, I was there. So it's that kind of a thing.
How did you get interested in learning how to pick locks?
So I was when I came to Philadelphia, I came here trying to become more involved in the peace movement, and I was especially wanted to be more involved in civil disobedience. And within a couple of weeks of getting here, I met some people who were involved with the draft board raid movement. So I got involved with that, and I quickly realized that manual skills were not their strong point. And so I'm like, oh, I could be helpful to these people. I actually know how to do stuff. So it's getting in was often a problem. So I'm like, I'm gonna take a course in locksmithing. So that was my motivation, so I could break into draft doors.
He was known as the locksmith.
When they arrested me in Camden, they brought special handcuffs from Washington D.C. that were supposedly picked. Do you remember that?
I remember.
Yeah, that was. I made a joke about him, and I found out that FBI agents don't have much of a sense of humor.
Yeah.
I have a question about the files. The ones that were in the media office, were they files about people that were living in this area, like Delaware Valley? Or did they include people from all over?
They were mostly about, the records about individuals were about people that either lived here or had a connection here. There were a lot of files about policies that were national policies.
Like I saw one with an Idaho name and the Washington University or whatever,
Right.
in the film.
And so sometimes, like, I don't know if you remember the bombing in University of Wisconsin, the Mathematics Research Center. One of the files was on Leo Burt, who was one of the people who was never caught, but his parents lived in Villanova, so that kind of thing.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, going through all of that must have taken you how many days back in the motel?
You know, I don't remember exactly, but it was several days, basically 24 hours straight.
How did you decide where and how to send them?
Well, that was really Bill and John primarily. You know, I was, a kid practically right off the boat from Ohio, and my understanding of the media and political tactics and stuff was pretty limited, and I knew it. So I just felt like I'm going to leave it up to them to figure out where to send it. So they were quite well aware of who was who in the press, and luckily, even though Betty was somebody without much of a reputation nationally, if any nationally, luckily she was on the list because that's what enabled the files to get to her without the FBI intercepting them on the way. Scoop Nelson was one of the people we sent it to, and he died never knowing that he had been sent a copy of the files because somebody there was an FBI informant and grabbed them and sent them back.
There were 5 people in the original mailing, and only the Washington Post actually published. All the rest, if you noticed, they ran them down at different points in the film. Not only didn't publish, but immediately called the FBI and said, "Hey, we've got your stuff here. Come and get it."
That's how close it was.
Including Senator McGovern
Right.
and Representative Perrin Mitchell, which were the most anti-war in the Congress.
But that was a copy of the original files.
Correct.
Yeah, so you guys still have the originals.
Right.
Where are they now?
We burned them.
Did you?
Yeah. They're besides being files, they were also evidence.
Yes. Good point.
So as soon as we got enough copies out to know that the information was out there, we got rid of them.
There were also some things that were just regular crimes and all, and you didn't want that to be public, so
Exactly.
that was all burned at the same time?
Yeah.
As, practicing civil libertarians, are you concerned that the environment today is vastly different from the environment back in the 70s, in that we have digital files, so the ordinary citizen breaking into a place couldn't possibly find, capture, read, access any of this stuff? And that strengthens the hands of the authorities. I mean, despite
They
what's
can get
noted.
it online.
Well,
I mean, I think each new set of technology can seem impenetrable, but,
So is it fair to say you're not as worried as perhaps I am?
no, I am worried. I am worried that there is a kind of repression going on with a kind of smiling face, and it's not very visible, and there's not much organization against it. I mean, the striking example was after 9/11. I mean, we had been in the business before that, mostly anyway, of saying any country has to honor human rights, even if they're under attack, even if they're at war or civil war. they still can't hold people without charges. Well, you know, we get hit once. It's not even an opposing army. It's some people who got pretty lucky, I think, in a strange way with their turning our own technology on us. And 3,000 or so people died. It was horrible. But we just immediately said to George W. Bush, we don't want our civil liberties anymore. Just do anything you can to stop this from happening again. And it just was amazing to me how quickly and how easily we just shed all those rights, which are what's supposed to make us different.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The new technology certainly would make it impossible for me to break in, but it doesn't make it impossible for somebody who's 25 to break in. I mean, you know, in the sense of that's, you know, Ed Snowden got stuff that he, you know, wasn't supposed to have.
It does seem reasonable that it would have to be an insider.
Much more so, yes. But they still have, I mean, there still is some databases people can find ways to get access to externally, depending on how careful they are about protecting. But, you know, the other thing about the environment and what Dave just said about 9/11, I think if 9/11 had happened in 1976, you know, people would have been just as outraged, but they would have been much more reluctant to give up their civil liberties because their memory was recent, you know, of what they had to worry about from their own government. And it's, the worst abuses are far enough in the past that people were, you know, much more complacent about it.
She's got her hand up.
I just was wondering, in regards to Camden, did you represent everyone, and what was the defense theory that resulted in the acquittal?
Wow. We did a very unusual defense where the defendants spoke for themselves, but also had lawyers who were speaking for them. And at first it was lawyers for specific people, but it was all too complicated. The judge didn't care, we didn't care. So the lawyers just spoke like we were speaking for everybody, and each individual defendant spoke. And there were two defenses. There was a defense based on the FBI. It's not real clear from this film, because this film it's a sidelight. The FBI sent in an informant who basically made the action happen, thought up all the strategies. It was a very unusual action for that movement in that it was a burglary of a downtown building in an urban center. It was the courthouse, federal courthouse building. And it had night watchmen, and they just, you know, the other draft board raids or the media raid, they stayed away from that. And all the tools and the strategies, even a bag full of groceries every week for everybody to eat, was all provided by the FBI. Because as you heard at the end, the FBI thought they had the media people if they could get the Camden 28. So they wanted the Camden action to happen. They sat, you know, waiting for it, swooped in, and busted them all. So it got complicated. There's a movie on that that's really also quite good, won a lot of awards, called The Camden 28. And you can buy it, you can get it from Netflix. Yeah. You can buy it. And so there was a defense based on that was a little complicated because it didn't fit traditional entrapment. In traditional entrapment, if you're predisposed, you can't raise the defense, and these were some very predisposed people. So that was a problem, and it's an interesting thing to think about. I wrote about it too in a memoir called Philadelphia Freedom. There's a whole treatment of that. But the second defense was what's usually called jury nullification. We urged the jurors to say, look, you know, usually breaking into a building and destroying pieces of paper is a crime, just like the Boston Tea Party. Usually pouring tea into a bay is a crime, right? You're destroying somebody else's property. But in this instance, it was merited because of how deeply wrong the country was in Vietnam. And that considering that, they should think in terms of whether they want to brand the people who did that as criminals. And that would be up to them. And It isn't clear exactly how many jurors went for that. There were certainly at least 2 we know of. But if you think about the equivalent, as Ned Murphy said towards the end of the bid on that, it was the only real acquittal in any big anti-war case of that time. Getting all 12 of them required, I think, that entrapment defense. But the 2 and the defendants talking for themselves, along with lawyers, just everything was so chaotic leading up to the first day of trial. I never would have thought it was going to work, but it almost immediately fell together. And still, at the end, when the jury went out, we didn't know what they'd do. We had no idea.
Yeah, and I was much, much less involved in all that than Dave was, but my intuitive sense of it was that both aspects of the defense were necessary to get the acquittal. If we'd gone with just one or the other, we would have been convicted, I think. Because I think it was like people mixed the two in their minds. You know, they really, because of their feeling about the war, they really wanted to find us not guilty, but because of their feelings of obligation to the legal system, they really felt like they couldn't unless they had some legal, hook to hang their hat on. And that the entrapment defense was, gave them that hook. So.
Were you drafted?
No, I was. It's kind of a funny story. So I when I went in for my physical, that you have to fill out all this paperwork. You're probably roughly my age. You remember this. And when they got to the conscientious objection part, I put down that I was a conscientious objector on the grounds that I didn't believe in fighting in imperialist wars. And they stamped that rejected right away. But I was even skinnier then than I am now. And they actually made me 4F because they said I was too skinny for the infantry. Which is kind of funny because one of my favorite hobbies then and now is backpacking. And I regularly, hump a third of my body weight up 5,000 feet, so I'm not complaining, don't get me wrong, because I would have had to go to jail for that. But I kind of got off easy.
I got a deferment for going to law school, of all things. It was such a class-based system. Can you imagine? People were really being drafted from their lives, no matter what they were doing. But there were people who were getting an MBA who could get a deferment, almost any graduate school. And that enabled me to get ready to do these kinds of cases, so I appreciate it. That's someone else who acted in this period, John Braxton, who was a war resistor and went to jail for it.
Yeah, just a personal note, because I was a draft resistor, and for a while considered doing some draft board raids also. And before I was sent away for the draft resistance, I was involved in a group that was looking at casing out some draft boards. And but then I decided I was like up to my neck in this trouble already. And so actually so I was in prison when the Camden 28 were arrested, and I looked at the names and said, oh yeah, I was involved with planning with some of those folks. So my hat's off to you for both of those actions that you did. It was really very bold and courageous, and had some very positive effects.
As was what you did.
Absolutely.
Nice work with a crowbar.
Thanks.
I think behind you maybe one more.
Okay, we're gonna have time for one more question, guys.
Hi, thank you very much for all of this. From the media, now we're getting about it, and what you did before, of course. I just quickly, my wife and I met Bonnie and John about the time that this happened. They were living in Germantown, where we still live. Right. And my wife worked with her child in a daycare, and then she was our kid's daycare teacher. Never in our wildest dreams could we have imagined that the two of them were involved in this raid, which we, of course, knew of, because we were, of course, in the anti-war movement like everybody else was. But it's amazing to me that you could keep your mouth shut for so long about something that was so exciting, and I can't even imagine doing it. that's just an aside, but I really am curious about the use of this film in the future. And you mentioned Netflix, I mean, do you know what will happen with it? Because it is something people need to see, because I think, you know, the response of Edward Snowden stuff for many of my children's generation is, it's not a big deal, everybody knows what I do anyway. There's not a concern about surveillance and what the danger of that can be, and this does point that out, so I'm wondering about
You all can help some, but it's now held over for another week here. It's also in some other areas. Downtown at Philomoka, the museum is running it next week, and it's here, you heard it, another week here. It's also going to be on PBS. It's going to be shown on public television. And I think what you can do is, if you're part of any groups, or if you just have informal email lists, if you publicize it, that'll get it around. I think it should get to educational institutions and a much broader audience, but we can help and try and do that.
Right.
Did you want to add?
Yeah, just, you know, especially, there's been several showings at universities, but I wish there were some showings at high schools. You know, that's what I'd like to see. So far, I haven't been in.
Okay, folks, we'd like to thank Mr. Harris and Mr. Forsythe for being here today. As well, I'd like to thank you for coming out to Bryn Mawr Film Institute. Like we said, the show will be running at least until not tomorrow, Thursday, the following Thursday. If anybody wants to come back, or tell a friend that we have it here.
What was your name
We
again, sir?
appreciate you coming out today, and then we'll
What was
have
your
a
name
good
again, sir?
David Carries.
David Carries?
Carries, yeah.
It's okay, it's okay. Things happen. Good, glad you made it. You guys have a good night.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Keith.
Yes, sir.
I want to thank you. I got you guys on,
Hey, on video.
on video here. What was your name, full name?
Keith Forsythe.
Keith Forsythe? Thank you.
Sure.